All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us on this not yet snowy morning. We'll see if that changes anytime. But we hope everyone is cozy and tucked up wherever they are comfortable for the next little bit of this presentation. And maybe you have a cup of tea or some coffee. But we look forward to sharing our program with you today. So as always, our chat feature will be functional. So if you do have any questions, feel free to put in the chat. We also do have the Q&A where you can actually put a question in and it will pop up and tell me if there is a question that needs to be answered. So either of those are an option. If you want to test it, feel free to send a chat or a question and just to make sure it works, up to you. And Terri is our presenter, as always, and I know a lot of you already know this, but I think we have a few new people. So Terri has been doing genealogy since 2000. So she's very knowledgeable, and we're very lucky that she has offered to do all these classes for us. And she's been a volunteer with the museum since 2018. So we're so excited that she is doing these programs, and they've been a lot of fun so far. And I hope everyone enjoys our birth certificates and related documents today. So without further ado, we're going to pass it over to Terri and start the presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And thank you for setting aside about an hour of your time for us to talk this morning. I want to thank the museum for coordinating all of this and for allowing us to do these presentations each month. Last month, we talked about love and marriage, so it kind of follows that this month we'll talk about birth records. So let's just dive right in. What are vital records? They're primarily the recording of births, marriages, and deaths. Divorces also fall into this category as well. The first vital records were actually kept by the church in the form of christenings and burials, along with the marriages, and in very rare cases, the divorces. We need to look at the idea of birth certificates specifically. It's not until the 1850 census that we see children with their parents. Prior to that, it was just the head of the household, and birth certificates did not exist. Birth records in some form or other may have existed, but we have had no national level recording of births. It has been up to the states. And this movement started in the 1880s. It was not implemented in most states until the 1910s, teens, and some states even lagged behind that. And it wasn't until the 1920s that all states came into compliance. I know from my own personal research, I have a cousin that was born in Texas in 1927, and I have not been able to find his birth certificate, but I was able to find the birth certificate for his older sister who was born in 1923. So sometimes it's catch as catch can, even as late as the 1920s. Many of the older birth records may have just recorded the parents' names, the date of birth, and the sex of the child. They may not have even recorded the name of the child on the actual record. Some of these early records also list just a christening date or a baptism date rather than the actual birth date. And people had several days in order to register the birth of a child. It didn't actually have to happen on the day of the birth. There are also hospital certificates that are issued. And here again, a child did not have to be named before going home from the hospital. Here is a copy of a hospital certificate, and this is a relatively recent one from 1975. And we do see that Jennifer Lynn Burton was born, and it gives her parents' names and the actual date of her birth. Many of us have these hospital certificates for either ourselves or perhaps our children. And on the back, we see further information where we get the father's actual birth date, his birth date, as well as where he was born, and the mother's maiden name, where her birth date and where she was born. And what's always wonderful to see is the footprint of the child. This is more typical of some of the state birth certificates that we find. And for any of you that have seen some of my previous presentations, this is one of my favorite ones. This is a female child by the last name of Novick, and she's born in 1900 in Cook County, Illinois. And the reason it's my favorite is that they ask for the full name of the mother. Now, if anyone should have been recorded, it should have been the mother. But no, we see the name of the father on this birth certificate. And we also see who reported it. This is a 1900 birth certificate. So Annie might have been a relative or a midwife at this point. It probably was not a hospital birth in 1900. In doing further research, we do find, and here's an error again, but we do find that the child was named Aggie Novak, and that should be a V rather than an R. But the birth date matches, the place matches, the father's name matches, and we do finally find her mother's maiden name. And obviously, she was named after her mother. Oops, excuse me. Other birth certificates may look differently, but they are all going to pretty much record the same set of information. We find the name of the child, the date that they were actually born, the place of birth, and we find that the parents' names, occupations, where they were possibly born, as well as where they might be currently living. We notice that Joseph Louis is the 6th child in this family. And we notice also in this particular birth certificate that it records whether the child is living or stillborn. There is more information about that. Most birth certificates, especially the newer ones, are actually titled Certificate of Live Birth. So you may not find stillborns among them. And the doctor that attended, as well as who is registering the information. A little bit different format, but this is 1920, and it is from the state of Massachusetts, but we still see the name of the child, when the child was born, and the name of the parents, as well as the mother's maiden name, where they were living, how old they were at the time, and what his occupation was. Moving on, this one is from Georgia, and here again, very, very similar information. We have the child's name, when he was born, parents' names, where they were born, and their ages. Again, we have a 6th child in the family. So we're still having large families at this particular point in time. And this one is from 1947, so relatively late. We need to make a comment here that because of Privacy Act and the restrictions that are imposed, that records should remain dormant for 72 years, it is rare that you're going to find a birth certificate, especially online, for someone born as late or after 1940s. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and how to find other information about births for our descendants. Finally, we look at one from the state of Colorado, And while it contains very much the same information, it is in a little bit different format, but we have the name of the child, birth, father's name, mother's maiden name, and where they were from originally. And this also gives us clues to where to look backwards. The father in this particular case is from Ohio, so you would need to look backwards for him in Ohio in both the census and perhaps for a birth certificate for him as well. But what happens if you don't have a birth certificate? What if you were born after or prior to that 1920s date and there is no certificate for your birth? There are other possible ways to look for the recording of births. Most of these date from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, but there are some records that may precede those dates. They may be a little bit more difficult to find. Certainly they may not be on the internet, but they may also exist. So we're going to take a look at each one of these types of records for you to find as either primary or secondary sources for the births of your ancestors. There are such things as birth registers. In doing my family history research, I have found these mostly for the state of Massachusetts. I have not found them for many other states, but this one dates from the 1800s and it is a listing of births. It gives the date of the birth, the name of the child, the sex of the child, where the family was living. And in this particular case, it happens to be a street address. This is from Lowell, Massachusetts. So virtually all of these children were born in Lowell. It gives the father's name as well as the mother's name, but note that there is no maiden name recorded in this particular case. There are other registers where I have seen both the father's name as well as the mother's full name or maiden name. It gives the father's occupation and where the parents were born. In most of these cases, both of the children were born, both of the parents were born in Canada. Lowell was a huge mill town throughout the 18 and early 1900s, and they used Canadian immigrants for the work in the mills. But we do see a couple that the father was born in Canada, but the mother was born in New York, or the actual Boston, Massachusetts versus Lowell, Massachusetts. So a lot of information may be contained in a birth register. Later on, this one happens to be from the state of Texas. They did annual accounting of births for that particular state, and I have extracted some of the information. This is an extracted copy, not a primary document, but we do get the births of these particular children. We see the names of many, but we also see just simple infant of Joseph. We don't know in this particular case whether the child lived or died, but they did record at least that a child of Francisco, Carl, or John was born. It lists the county in which they were born and the date within 1911 where they were born. This is also the birth certificate number. And one of the cautions in this particular thing is that births could be recorded at the county level first, and a number was assigned at the county level. The birth was then sent on to the state level for recording there, and the state birth certificate was also issued a number, but it was different than the county number. So if you're happening to write for or request a copy of a birth certificate and you want to use the number, be sure you understand whether it is a county certificate or a state certificate number when requesting. We can also find some extractions of records from town clerk's offices. These are not necessarily going to be online. They may be in town clerk meeting minutes or in a county courthouse. This one I did happen to find. It's an extraction from a book, and it records Martha Crowfoot's family in Washington County, New York. And it's as early as 1789. So some of these records do exist. We notice that she has children without birth dates. We are hoping that they lived until approximately the 1850 census, so that perhaps we could get an idea of, is this the correct birth order for these children? But we notice that they are all born in Dilliontown in the Bay State, which was Massachusetts. However, they're now living in New York. Joseph was born actually in New York. So we have the move, and if we could determine their birth dates, we would know approximately when they moved from Massachusetts to Granville. We also noticed that the last child, March, was born in January of 1785, and so probably in the town of Granville. Looking at military records, we have the World War I draft registration that many of us have turned to for information. And one of the primary sources for birth records for those people from the mid to late 1800s are the draft registration records. Here is one from Albany County, New York, and this happens to be my grandfather. He was born in September of 1874. It lists his name, where he is working, and who is the person that is always going to know where he resides or his whereabouts. In this particular case, I happen to know that is my grandmother. There were 3 registrations for World War I, an A, B, and C, and they were done between the years of 1917 and 1918. So that will help you to determine in those intervening 10 years, where did your people live, as well as possible family relationships. One of the nice things, if you did not know this person, or if it was your ancestor that had predeceased your birth, you get an idea of a brief idea of their physical description. Brown hair, brown eyes, of medium build and medium height. So some good and valuable information. There were also registrations in World War II. There were numerous registrations. There were the old man's draft as well as the young man's draft. So here again, in the old man's draft, we get those people that were born in the late 1800s, or even as early as perhaps the mid to late 1800s. We see the person who is always going to know what their address was. In this particular case, from census information, I happen to know that this is also his wife. I want you to also realize that prior to World War I, the Army maintained registration records of those who enlisted in the various years. They may have enlisted for a period of 3 years or 5 years of service. And in those records, they also give, at a minimum, the age of the person as well as where they were born. So that might help you look further. And those records are online at Ancestry. A request for a military headstone or marker might also provide information for you as far as your ancestors' birth. This one happens to be for a soldier that was probably killed during World War II, but it does give his birth date, and the tombstone is to be sent to the Oddfellows Cemetery in Abernathy, Texas. We assume that this is his widow, Carrie, because it's 1949. However, it might be a daughter or some other family member. Newspapers are a valuable source of information as well. Newspapers, especially in the 1900s, had huge society sections that would appear probably in the Sunday newspaper and announced weddings, as we talked about previously. But hospitals also routinely sent in lists, sometimes weekly, of births that they had recorded, and these would be published in the newspaper. These happen to be from Troy, New York, and they happen to be later. And this is one of those things where if you are looking for descendants, those that are potentially still alive, their births might be recorded. We see a birth from 1943, Mr. and Mrs. L.M. Russett, and they have given birth to the daughter, Virginia Ann. And fortunately, in this particular case, they identify that Mrs. Russett was the former Helen Zerugian. By the same token, we have the birth of Mary Kathleen Quinn on April 13th, as late as 1955, and we have her mother's maiden name. So scour those newspapers because they may have the information you are looking for. And unfortunately, we have obituaries, and they tell us also perhaps the birth date of the person. This one happens to be January 12th of 1928, and he died extremely recently. It will give a history, sometimes a lot of information, other times not so much. Many times I notice that obituaries record the person's age, that they are 81 years old, rather than giving the full birth date of the person. It also records where he might have been born, as well as his parents' names and the mother's maiden name. This is a wonderful obituary. And on a personal note, I recommend, what do you want your obituary to say? Do you want all of this information to be recorded in your obituary? If you do, I recommend that you write your own. Cemetery records, Find a Grave, Billion Graves, interment.net. These all record tombstones or cemetery records. Not everyone has a tombstone. Many of these records will record a birth date as well as a death date and where the person is buried. Sometimes the death might be simply the year, or excuse me, the birth might be simply the year. The death might also be simply a year. I have noticed in going back over some of these records, revisiting the sites with several years in between, that families have entered a lot of information about their deceased person. You may find an obituary from a newspaper either clipped and photographed or actually retyped that will give you the full family history of that person. Many of my ancestors came from Quebec in Canada, and I have noticed that even some of the ancestors from the 16 and 1700s have also been recorded on Find a Grave, whether they have a tombstone or not. And they will list spouses, sometimes parents, as well as children. So further information for you to track either ancestors or descendants. School records. I know that when I attended school, every year we were given a manila card and we were asked to fill it out with our own information about our name and our birth date. And we were also asked to fill it out for any younger siblings that might also be attending school. I have not found many of these records online. This is from Ancestry, I believe. It's either Ancestry or Family Search. And these are from the state of Oklahoma. They have done a wonderful job in recording school records from the early 1900s. So we see in this particular case a blended family. We see Jess Driscoll is listed as the parent or guardian, and we see Mrs. Driscoll has signed as the parent or guardian at the bottom. But we find children named Barnes as well as a couple of Driscoll children. Yes.
And sorry, just to go back one slide real quick, we did have a question. What were some of the other sites you mentioned other than Find a Grave?
Okay, there's findagrave.com and there's billiongraves.com, all one word. And there's also interment.net. And these three sites will list death and burial dates, as well as many times give pictures of actual tombstones. So thank you. So as I've said, these school records are not necessarily easily available, but they might be at a county courthouse or in a library where your ancestors actually lived. The census from 1850 onwards records an actual person's actual age. And in many cases, as we've discovered in doing our census research, the men usually age 10 years, but the women not so much. They may average between 7 and 10 years. So their ages are not 100% proof of their actual date of birth, but they do give us clues and windows of opportunity to narrow down the time frames. The 1900 census is the one exception that actually gives a month and year of birth. Here again, it depends on who is actually providing the information. In most cases, the women knew when their children were born, but not necessarily the father, knowing the actual month and year of their children's births. We also run into the case where there might be large families, so children may be confused with older siblings or deceased siblings, etc. So here again, this gives us a clue to help us narrow down where to go looking for further records of birth. Most of the state censuses are very, very similar to those of the federal census. However, this one is from 1905, and it is a state census from Rhode Island. And they filled out individual cards for each person in the household. And it does give an actual birth date on the card. This is a wife, and she has had 3 children, all 3 of whom are still alive. The difficulty with this particular case is if you do have family in Rhode Island in 1905, because this is a single card, matching it up with her husband and her other children is very, very difficult. You need to look in the city and you need to scroll through all the people with the same surname to find, are they all living at the same address? And with a first name of Marie, there might be 20 or 30 of them. So you may not have hit upon the right person in the first case. So putting the family together to get all of the information may prove to be very difficult, but it is a particular source that is unique. Libraries and history centers frequently have county histories. Were your people among the first people to live in that particular county? Or were they prominent people in that particular county? In each of those cases, they may have had a biography written for the publication of the county history. County histories were usually published on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the county, or a sesquicentennial, 150 years, or a 200-year history. In either case, you may be able to find a biography. The person may be listed and it may give a birth date for him. It's going to include when they actually settled there, what their occupation was. Most of them were into farming. Did they also participate in some other form of business? Did they own a store in addition to farming? Were they beekeepers in addition to farming? But they'll give a brief biography. And if you're lucky, they will also say when the person married, who they married, and delineate any children that might have been born. In this particular case, it just says that he had 4 sons and 1 daughter. But many of them do also list the birth dates for each of the sons or daughters and who they might have married to get a complete family history. In some of them, you might also find photographs of the family. So don't overlook county histories. Many of these are not online. This is something that you'll have to actually make a trip to the locality where your people lived. But you can try library catalogs to see if the history of the county where your people lived might have been written. Family Bibles. Don't we all wish we had a copy of the family Bible that listed the family members as we know them? Here again, it depends on how and who is recording the information. In this particular case, we see a Wagner family, and we assume that Lacey is probably Albert's wife, and these are their children. We notice 3/4 of the way down that the spelling of the name has changed, and we get an O inserted into the names of the children. Are they, so what is the correct family name? How are we going to find them in the census? Will they be recorded as Wagoners or Wagners? The other thing to take into consideration with family Bibles is just the immediate family being recorded, or is the extended family recorded? I know that my mother always kept track of all of the births in the family. So we would be potentially confused if we saw 2 or 3 children that were born in the same year with the same surname. Which one is actually Albert's child versus a cousin, a niece, or a nephew. And that's where corroborating evidence in the census would help you with that. One note in terms of genealogy societies are always willing to accept the information taken from family Bibles. They do not have to be from the particular county or city where the genealogy society is located. So if you happen to live in Colorado, but you have a family Bible from Michigan, a local genealogy society will record that information in their quarterly publications so that the information is disseminated out there. Then it would be a matter of going to a library to try and track down the information. Excuse me. Family Bible information may also have been extracted and put out on the internet for all to share. Sometimes there will be family pages. You might find a Webster family website where this Bible has been transcribed and published on the internet. So look for family name societies in doing your research, and you may be able to find the births of children as well as their parents. And some of them will predate significantly the current records that exist. Social Security cards. Social Security became law in 1935. And in order to qualify for Social Security, you had to register your birth and provide a birth certificate. If no birth certificate was on file, there were opportunities for people to register their birth at that time. They had to go to the county clerk's office and have their birth registered. There is the Social Security Death Index, which is available on both Ancestry and on Family Search. And it gives the person's name, their birth date, when the Social Security card was issued, the state that issued the card, the person's last residence, not necessarily where they actually died, and the date of death. And here again, we see that it is simply June of 1981. Sometimes it will be just the year. Another thing to notice is in this particular case, the Social Security number is actually given on the form. If you want further information, you could write to the Social Security Administration, provide that number, and get the actual application that the person filled out. After about 1995 to 2000, the Social Security number no longer appears in the Social Security Death Index. Here again, probably because of Privacy Act restrictions. This is what one of the Social Security applications actually looked like. These used to be very inexpensive. They used to be about $6 a piece. The last time I looked, they were costing about $23. And I have noticed in the last few years that Ancestry has been adding the extractions of the extracted information from Social Security applications as well as claims files. But here we have the actual information that the person himself provided. Raymond Brecker, where he was living at the time, and this is 1936, shortly after the Social Security Act was actually implemented. Where he is working and the address of his employment, his birth date, as well as where he was born. His parents, his father, and his mother with her maiden name. So these cards do exist and do provide very valuable information, but I would suggest that you look elsewhere first for potentially less costly ways of finding the information. One word of caution about Social Security cards. When Social Security was first implemented, not everyone was eligible for Social Security. Farmers, for example, did not collect Social Security. Private proprietors, individual proprietors, did not qualify for Social Security. So if your people died in the 1940s through the 1960s, you may not find a Social Security death index registration because they never collected Social Security. If your people were fortunate enough to travel, they might have a passport application. These have been posted on Ancestry, and while this one is extremely messy, it does give Dosha Cooney's birth date of 21 April in 1856, and she was born in Cooper County, Missouri. If you look for passport applications, make sure you look for both sides of the information. This is just the top part of the first page, but there is a second page to the application, which sometimes gives a physical description of the person and may even have the photo. Later ship passenger lists might also give you opportunity to find a birth date. We see this ship coming from Antwerp, Belgium, in 1935, and a listing of some of the passengers aboard, as well as what their birth dates and places of birth are. So, older passenger ship lists for our ancestors that might have immigrated from overseas in the 1800s and early 1900s are probably not going to have this information. But if your immigrant ancestor might have returned to the old country at some point and then come back into the United States, and you might find a birth date for them in these particular records. With the implementation of Social Security, we talked about the fact that people would have to, if they did not have a birth certificate, they would have to register their birth. And in doing that, they completed what are called delayed birth certificates. Frequently, these are recorded in a 1940 county birth index, which is kept separate from the normal county birth index. These birth certificates may record the births of people born as early as 1858. So it does behoove you to try and look for someone, even if they have an early birth date. One word of caution, these are not necessarily filed in the state in which the person was born, but rather in the state where the person was currently living. The other thing is that they may have been filed significantly later. In many cases, we find that these are completed and filed when the person was approaching or had already approached 65 years of age and wanted to collect their Social Security. So finding the year of filing as well as the place of filing proves a challenge, but it can be done. These delayed birth certificates are available on Ancestry as well as through Family Search. And as we've just said, they may have been filed many years later, and they were completed when the person filed evidentiary documents that certified the date of birth. In many cases, an affidavit from a family member was provided to certify that the child was indeed born on that particular date. We'll take a look at several of these and see some of the information that might have been provided as proof of the person's birth date. The original applications might have included baptismal certificates or family Bible records. Unfortunately, we do not have access to those documents. We simply have the actual delayed certificate. Here we're going to look at several of these. This one happens to be from the state of West Virginia, and we see that Alfred Rufus Mills was born in 1893, and where he was born, his father's name and his birthplace, his mother's maiden name and her birthplace. And we are doing this in 1957, when he's turning about 65 years old. In this particular case, he is 65. The information that he's providing, he's got an affidavit from an uncle. He has his honorable discharge from the Army, along with his Army service number. So further places for you to look for information about Alfred. And we have an insurance policy that is used as proof of his particular age, and the information from each one of those documents, where they were issued, and the father and mother's names recorded, whether or not they are recorded in those particular documents. This one is from North Carolina, and like the birth certificates, the format may be a little different, but the information contained is very, very much the same. We have Hugh. He is born in 1904, where he was born, and who attended the birth. The full name of his father, his mother, and where each of them were born. And it gives their birth years as well. And the 3 certifying documents that show that he indeed was born at that particular time. This is one that is recorded in 1942, soon after that 1940 birth index was created. So it's long before he turned 65. So points out that these records could be recorded at any particular time. This one is likewise from the state of Texas. It gives us Mary's name, her father's name, her mother's maiden name. And we see that they were born in Texas and Tennessee. And the 3 certifying documents that show and prove that she was born in that particular year. These are recorded in 1963. So she's already 70 years old. So this is a case where she's filing afterwards, perhaps after the death of a husband or her significant support. And finally, we have one from South Dakota. And as we've seen before, very similar format. The person's name, the parents' names, where the parents were from, further information to dig into, and the recording of the information, Nebraska license, marriage license, and a census record is used, as well as the affidavit of parentage. Church records. Church records definitely preceded all of these state required records. And it may be the only information or the only place where you can find those that were born prior to the 20th centuries. They deal with essentially the same information in terms of the child's birth, their date of birth, as well as the parents' names and sometimes witnesses. But in many cases, this is going to record either a christening date or a baptism date, rather than the actual birth date. If your family belonged to a church affiliation that included infant baptism, you may want to look at those particular records. We see that the Congregational, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Reformed, Catholic, and Methodist churches did practice infant baptism. So these records do exist. We're not going to go in depth into these records today. We will probably have a completely separate section on church records in the future. The reason for that is that church records, some may be online, many of them are in a browsable fashion as well as rather than searchable by name. And many of them also are not on the internet, but instead have been retained by the churches and may have been microfilmed. Finding your ancestors' church affiliation and their membership is the difficult part. So we will cover that in a completely separate session. But I just want you to know that these records do exist and that perhaps they may be the source of some valuable information for you. In many cases, the sponsors may have been family members, whether they be grandparents, cousins, aunts and uncles, or even the older siblings being appointed the godparents of a younger child. You may run into those instances. Here's an example of a church certificate. We've got the name of the child, the name of the father, the name of the mother, when the child was born, and when the child was baptized. We notice at the bottom that the sponsors in this case were also Fitzgibbons, the same name as the mother's maiden name. So chances are this might be a grandfather and grandmother, it may be an uncle and an aunt, or it may be older siblings. Further information would need to be looked into. And this is a copy that was produced in 81, and it might have been significantly afterwards. You can actually write to these churches and get this information and for your records. Churches are very willing to look up the information for you. For those of you that might have immigrant ancestors from especially the 1800s and so, just know that there are church registers overseas as well as here in the United States that record the births of children and their parents' names. And we see this particular one is from a church in the city of Dublin, Ireland. This one happens to be from my own family, and it dates early on. It is from the year 1707. It is written in French. And what's interesting about this is a young boy. He was born in actually 1689, and it gives his father's name, Dickory Sargent, and his mother's name, Maria Aubin. The text in the bottom describes how he was captured by Indians and His family lived in Massachusetts, and he was actually captured by Indians. His father and mother were killed. The 4 siblings were all taken to Canada. His oldest brother actually returned to Massachusetts, but Daniel Sargent actually remained in Quebec and was ransomed off, and the governor, Philippe Rougeau, actually saved him. And his name was actually changed to Daniel Serrien, similar spelling as Sargent, and they added Langlais, the Englishman. So all of his descendants are either Serrien or Langlais family members. So you never know what you're going to find in church records. And another significant contribution to early birth dates are Quaker records. If you delve back into your family history at some point, you may run into some Quaker records. This one happens to be a recording from a monthly meeting, and it records an entire family and when each one of the children was born in the 1600s. So very, very valuable information in Quaker records. And when we talk about the church records, we will go more in depth into these. And I believe that concludes our presentation for this morning. So we'll open it up to any questions at this time, and to let you know that with April 15th quickly approaching, we're going to cover tax records next month.
Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or also feel free to put them in the Q&A section. I'm monitoring both, so now's your chance to ask any questions you have. Obviously, if you think of something later, you're more than welcome to email the museum at historycenter@canyoncity.org. I'll pop out in the chat for anyone. You can always send us an email, and I will forward those on to Terri if we have anything that comes up later. If you wanted to see this presentation again, or you wanted to share it with someone, will be posted on our YouTube. Usually takes us a few days to get it up, so sometime next week likely it would be up on our YouTube. Also, if there's something you are interested in, saw you didn't get a chance to do some of the other presentations we've had, check our YouTube. We have those up as well. So, and obviously the museum is open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4, and our research room is free. The only thing we charge for is copies. So if you have family that is from this area, you're always welcome to come in and investigate our files at the museum. We did have a question. My ancestors are from Maine. Which part of Massachusetts before it became a state? Were the records transferred to Maine, or do we need to search in the Massachusetts records?
I would actually look at both. I have noticed very, very recently that many of the Boston, Massachusetts Catholic diocese records are being posted online, both on Ancestry as well as American Ancestors. Because state lines, county lines, etc., have changed back and forth, I would look in both places. I have found that Massachusetts records are, especially of births, are easier to find on the internet than Maine records have been. But here again, I would try to look at both. If you don't find them in one, I would try to find them in the other. You may use census information as well to see what the jurisdiction was when you find them in the census. If it's early on, if they are recorded in Massachusetts, I would go to the Massachusetts records first. If they are recorded as Maine residents, I would go to the Maine residents first.
Well, I think that brings up a kind of a good note when you're looking at kind of just records from countries even that have changed their borders. that a lot of times on passport things that I've come across, if you have someone who was born in Poland while it was part of Russia, or the country has changed, that it'll say the place the country currently is on the passport record or something similar to that. Oh, and it looks like we have another question. My relatives came from Slovakia and Hungary. Can I search with the Americanized name or the foreign name? For example, Alex is Sandor in Hungarian. Which is the best site to use for Hungarian/Slovakian records?
I have absolutely no idea. I apologize. Here again, turning to Google is probably your best source of information. I know on my father's side of the family, they came from Lithuania, and finding Lithuanian records has been an extreme challenge. So you do have my sympathy. I do completely understand. I would use the Google search and also the family history catalog to see if there are any books that might pertain to what the information that you're looking for. Google also has a Google Translate. So here again, you probably want to look for both sets of information. Are they using the anglicized name, or are they using the original birth name? So you have a difficult challenge, and you do have my sympathy.
All right, well, it looks like we don't have any more questions for the time being. Oh, let me add in our email really quickly for you, so that if anyone does have questions, they can always forward those on to us, and we will get them over to Terri and try to get those questions answered. So
I might also comment that if you have a particular topic that you would like to see covered in the genealogy research, if you would send that information, that request, to Kathleen as well, we will try to look into and develop a presentation that will meet your needs. This is information that we want you to benefit from and to share with others. So if you have a topic that has not been covered, or is maybe a little outside of the normal range of thinking, please submit your ideas.
yes, and you can send those again to historycenter@canyoncity.org. That comes to everyone at the museum. So we will keep an eye out for those if you do have a topic you think would be interesting or good for us to cover. All right, well, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us, and hopefully you learn some new things. I always learn new things, so I really enjoy getting to sit in on these presentations as well. And we hope everyone stays warm if it decides to start snowing.
Thank you for joining us this morning.